It is an honor to welcome you to today's lecture featuring Dr. Yii-Jan Lin. Dr. Lin holds a PhD in religious studies from Yale University, where she focused on New Testament. And to our surprise, she is the first Asian American woman who was hired and tenured in the history of Yale Divinity School. Dr. Lin's publications include her recent book, Immigration and Apocalypse: How the Book of Revelation Shaped American Immigration, published by Yale University Press in 2024. And her earlier work, The Erratic Life of Manuscripts, New Testament Textual Criticism and Biological Sciences, published by Oxford Uni Press in 2016. Her research has bridged the fields of biblical studies and cultural studies, opening new avenues for discussion surrounding the social and political implications of Scripture. In addition to her academic work, Dr. Lin is a sought-after commentator on the issues of race, immigration, and gender, having appeared in various media outlets and including radio, documentaries, especially YouTubes nowadays, right? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yii-Jan Lin. Come on.
Thank you so much, Professor Lim, and thank you all, and also to Yonsei Graduate School of Theology for having me here tonight, and for you for joining me this evening. I am excited to present some of the research from my book, Immigration and Apocalypse: How the Book of Revelation Shaped American Immigration. And I will be tracing the impact of the biblical book of Revelation on the ways American public conversation described and continues to describe immigrants, particularly Chinese immigrants, starting in the 19th century. But you will see how the themes that I discuss connect to American immigration history more broadly, and especially to current events in immigration in the United States right now. But as I begin the lecture, it might seem strange that the book of Revelation should have any impact at all on American political discourse and racial discourse. How can this strange book, last and marginal in the New Testament canon and marginal in its use through the centuries in worship and preaching, influence the history, policies, and attitudes of a nation? What does ancient Christian and Jewish apocalyptic literature have to do with immigration? The connection begins as early as the 15th century, during the age of European exploration and the voyages of Christopher Columbus. While Columbus was, of course, motivated by the political power and possibility of riches in finding a new route to the East for trading, he was also driven by religious belief and the conviction that the end of the world was fast approaching. Columbus had studied biblical prophecy, and Columbus was convinced that two prophecies needed to be fulfilled in order to bring about the last days and the beginning of God's reign on earth. He believed that the Christian gospel had to reach all peoples at the ends of the world, and that the holy city Jerusalem, then under the rule of the Muslim Mamluk Sultanate, must be conquered for Christ with a new crusade. Columbus believed that he himself would bring these prophecies to completion by his voyages into the West. First, he would reach lands where the gospel would spread, fulfilling the prophecy of every tongue and nation worshiping God. And furthermore, in those lands, which he understood to be the location of the Garden of Eden, of paradise itself, he would also find gold and treasures enough to fund a new crusade to capture Jerusalem. So he would fulfill the prophecy of Jerusalem once again belonging to Christians, so that Christ could begin his reign of 1,000 years here. When these two things had been accomplished, then God's rule on earth would begin and the new Jerusalem would descend. Columbus, in fact, wrote in his notebook collection of prophecies that the book of Revelation helped show him that place where he would find paradise across the sea. So from its moment of European discovery, the lands of America were full of apocalyptic significance, marking a new era and an apocalyptic one. So the New World became inextricably tied to the end of the world and to the New Jerusalem, God's holy city. And the association with the New Jerusalem not only marked the discovery of the New World, but also of America at the time of colonial settlement of New England. In the 1600s, religious leaders in England who had rejected the Anglican Church led their congregations to establish settlements in New England, the east coast of America. And these Puritans, as they were called, wanted to establish holy church communities, towns and cities in the colonies. Many Puritan believers thought that they were establishing the New Jerusalem in the New World, either figuratively or even literally. The Puritan John Davenport founded the city of New Haven, which is where I live and where Yale University is in Connecticut. And Davenport actually built the town plan to be like the heavenly city of the New Jerusalem, as a 9-square grid with measurements matching those of the Bible in the book of Ezekiel, which Revelation borrows from, and with the place of worship at its center on the town green. The perception of America as the New Jerusalem, the city of God, is also reflected in the writings of the Puritans, such as in Cotton Mather's Theopolis Americana or The American City of God. Mather compares America, and especially New England, to the golden heavenly city of Revelation, and uses this identification to inspire his readers and congregation to live holy lives because they are God's chosen. This kind of thinking, that America is chosen, led by God, and should be righteous and an example to the world, is also known as American exceptionalism. And it can be traced throughout United States history. American exceptionalism is also full of apocalyptic thinking that we can see with Columbus and with the Puritans, the understanding that America is a place of destiny and a holy place, to be described in glorious terms used in Revelation, and especially as the New Jerusalem. Revelation's dramatic, triumphal, and shining images and vocabulary can be found in descriptions of the Revolutionary War, during the Civil War, and in the expansion westward, where the driving out and killing of native peoples is justified because it is America's heavenly and apocalyptic destiny to establish the New Jerusalem on earth. We can trace the influence of Revelation all the way to the 1980s, and Ronald Reagan's repeated description of the U.S. as a shining city on a hill, a biblical reference not only from the Gospel of Matthew, but also alluding to Revelation and the identity of America as the New Jerusalem, the shining city that descends from heaven. In fact, in Reagan's speech to the nation in 1989, he describes America, the shining city, as built on strong foundations, busy with commerce and people of all kinds, with walls but with doors that are open for all with the will and the heart to get there. This is a direct allusion to the description of the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 21. Where the New Jerusalem is described as built on 12 foundations, where all the nations and kings of the earth enter bearing tribute, and where there are walls and the gates never shut. And this narrative of America as the New Jerusalem with walls and gates, but open gates that welcome in all peoples from all nations, is the mythical American story of immigration that portrays the U.S. as a glorious, God-chosen destination that is both strongly defended with walls and gates, but that is also welcoming to those, as Ronald Reagan said, with the will and the heart to get there. The America described in history by politicians and church leaders, newspapers, and pundits uses Revelation's positive imagery of the New Jerusalem to cast America as a heavenly refuge. But, of course, the book of Revelation, as is the case with most apocalyptic literature, heaven and its glories are not the only story. The apocalyptic text is also full of disaster, violence, judgment, and death. That's why the popular term apocalyptic means catastrophic, why we have movies called zombie apocalypses or post-apocalyptic, showing the afterlife of world-ending disasters. And this negative and violent side of Revelation is also part of American imagination of immigration. What do I mean by that? I mean that when America, from its discovery to today, is understood and identified as God's city, the New Jerusalem, as a heavenly paradise, using that metaphor also brings with it the dark side of Revelation's story. The New Jerusalem in the Bible does not let everyone in, and the people judged unworthy to enter are thrown into a lake of burning fire. The city has strong defensive walls, and battles are fought with God's enemies. These parts of Revelation's story are also a part of American vocabulary of immigration. It has been very easy for the same politicians, church leaders, pundits, journalists to portray unwanted immigrants as the enemies of God's kingdom, describing them in the same way Revelation describes those outside the walls of the New Jerusalem. Outside are the dogs, the sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters, and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. So pay attention to this description of those not allowed to emigrate into the New Jerusalem. You'll find the same strategic descriptions used against immigrant groups throughout American history. People are likened to animals and believed to be religiously bizarre and idolatrous, sexually depraved, violent, and liars. And this is the story told throughout US history about Chinese immigrants, and this story has used the images and metaphors from Revelation to exclude them. So the rest of this talk will weave together the story of Chinese immigration to the US and Revelation's apocalyptic metaphors and descriptions used against Chinese immigrants to exclude and discriminate against them. And these ways of excluding the Chinese have been used since then to exclude all Asian immigrants in the years following, including Korean immigrants, Indian, Japanese, Filipino, and other immigrants. I'm going to begin with a scene from 1870 in the western United States in Tijuana, Nevada. Tijuana lies in a desert landscape dotted with sagebrush. It is now a ghost town with no buildings still standing. But in 1870, it was a town connected by the Central Pacific Railroad to the city of Elko, about 100 kilometers away. January 5th, 1870 was probably a cold day, but railway workers in Tijuana probably liked the cold, considering the cargo they were loading onto a 6-car train headed west to Elko and on to San Francisco. They had to make sure that each car was packed with the remains of dead Chinese railroad workers, packed as full as possible, so the Central Pacific Rail would be well paid for the load. According to the newspaper, the Elko Independent, quote, "We understand that the Chinese companies pay the railroad company $10 for carrying to San Francisco each dead Chinaman. 6 cars well stuffed with this kind of freight will be a good day's work." The paper goes on to state, with the same astonishing callousness, the remains of the females are left to rot in shallow graves, while every defunct male is carefully preserved for shipment to the Occident. The western section of the Transcontinental Railroad had reached completion the prior year in 1869, largely through the labor of Chinese workers. The remains of the laborers who had died, whether by sickness, in construction accidents, from harsh conditions, or by plain murder, were collected for shipment back to China. Chinese miners had worked in Nevada's silver mines starting in the 1850s after the California gold rush. But unlike many other immigrants who had arrived to make their home in the US, they were not accepted as able to become Americans or citizens. In fact, the same year the bodies of the Chinese railroad workers were shipped from Nevada to San Francisco, on July 4, 1870, U.S. Congress voted not to allow Chinese immigrants to naturalize as citizens. During the Senate debate before the vote, Senator George Williams declared that he could not imagine how anyone would want Chinese people to belong to the nation. He said, "Is there anybody who will say that the Chinese is a desirable population? Mongolians, no matter how long they may stay in the United States, will never lose their identity as a peculiar and separate people. They will never amalgamate with persons of European descent." Williams, in that same statement, captures succinctly the racialization of Chinese and later other Asian peoples as perpetual foreigners throughout their history in the US up to today. At the end of the 19th century, the Chinese were perceived as the greatest threat by white residents in the western states. With the end of the gold rush in California, the closing of the mines in Nevada, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese laborers moved into other areas of work, and their communities continued to expand. While Chinese immigrants had faced discrimination and harassment since their arrival, the shift of Chinese labor away from the railroads, plus the ongoing arrival of Chinese immigrants in California, prompted still greater violence and hate against them. In anti-Chinese speeches before the Senate, opponents of Chinese immigration dwelled on the hordes of Chinese who were flooding into the United States, what Senator Thomas Bayard called an inundation of countless numbers and of a race wholly different, which would destroy the labor of our people. The Chinese inundation Bayard speaks of never amounted to more than 1/20th of all immigrants arriving in the US. Nevertheless, Chinese peoples were the first racial ethnic group targeted by a nationwide immigration law. The Page Law of 1875 effectively barred Chinese women from entering the United States on the grounds that they were sex workers and morally corrupting. Then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 further restricted the entry of Chinese immigrants by denying entry to Chinese laborers. While such claims may have calmed fears of an incoming flood of Chinese workers, it did nothing to protect the Chinese already in the US from violent racist hatred. Chinese in America had already experienced violence and expulsion in towns through intimidation and harassment in the 1870s. The brutality reached a climax in the 1880s, during which Chinese were shot, lynched, and tortured, not only in California, but in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, and other Western territories. In 1885, a group of 150 white men in Wyoming killed at least 28 Chinese coal miners, whom they shot, dismembered, and burned alive. In 1887, a gang of white men tortured, mutilated, and murdered at least 34 Chinese miners in Oregon. No one was ever convicted for these murderers, not in Wyoming or the Oregon massacres or after murders, lynchings, and mass expulsion from cities in California, Nevada, and Colorado. This hate created more legislation in 1884 and 1888, which further restricted Chinese entry, and in the Geary Act of 1892, which required all Chinese laborers, and later all Chinese, in the US to carry proof that they were in the country legally, thereby implementing the first such federal requirement for documentation, so the beginning of documentation for immigrants in the United States. Without a certificate, a Chinese laborer could be forced to do hard labor and be deported. They could not post bail or testify as witnesses in a trial. The Geary Act was not repealed until 1943. And Chinese entry visas were still then limited to only 105 per year until 1965. In the decades between the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and the Geary Act of 1904 and ever after, there were depictions of Chinese peoples and China as a looming, dangerous, ugly threat in American political speeches, newspapers, literature, and art. The Chinese had become the yellow peril. As in other moments of American crisis and hate, pundits and politicians have made use of the Book of Revelation to illustrate the situation, flipping the metaphor of America as the New Jerusalem to emphasize the existence of its enemies and the need for violent exclusion. Yellow peril tropes fit easily into the apocalyptic narrative of Revelation. At the foundation of apocalyptic yellow peril imagery and stories used to exclude Chinese from entry and acceptance in the United States lies the belief of a divine, unchangeable distinction between white Americans and the Chinese so-called race. This belief is at the core of the speech I quoted from Senator Bayard in 1882 before the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Bayard argued that opponents of restrictions on Chinese immigration had only money in mind and did not care about white Americans. He frames his entire argument in Christian language, saying, quote, "Those who want to import cheap Chinese laborers overlook and disregard the difference of race. They overlook the difference between Chinese and Christian civilization." But, Bayard argues, a man cannot faithfully serve two contending governments at the same time. Of course, Bayard means the United States and China in the immediate context, but he uses a biblical text that serves his purposes exactly. The text comes from the Gospel of Matthew and Luke. "No man can serve two masters, for he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money." Bayard implies that his fellow congressmen serve either China and greed or the US and God. The Chinese, in Bayard's view, were a race wholly separate and, more importantly, unchristian and unable of belonging to the people of God. Senator Williams argued in that same debate that to welcome in the Chinese was the same as worshiping, quote, "ignorance, idolatry, immorality, vice, disease, and prostitution, and sacrificing to these idols the pride and glory of American citizenship." It's no coincidence that Williams names ignorance, idolatry, immorality, vice, diseases, and prostitution as the deities identified with Chinese and China. These vices have characterized the East in European and American imagination for centuries. And these imagined traits of China and the Chinese play into both their allure and their threat in apocalyptic yellow peril discourse. Just as the Chinaman could be both useful coolie and the destroying enemy, so also could China be both the source of high-status luxury goods, silk, tea, porcelain, and the decadent and degenerate Babylon of Revelation, the enemy and antithesis of the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ. The whore of Babylon, who represents the city of Rome in the ancient context of Revelation, is fleshed out and enrobed in lavish, misogynist detail in the biblical text. It says in Revelation chapter 17, "And I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names, and it had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and impurities of her prostitution. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of horrors and earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus." Here appear all the characterizations of China in the anti-Chinese discourse of the Senate in the 1870s and 80s. Pagan idolatry, decadence and dissipation, greed, sexual corruption and prostitution, impurity and filth, and most threatening of all, the conquering, destruction, and eating of Christian peoples, the saints and witnesses of Jesus. While the U.S. senators do not explicitly call China the whore of Babylon, the likening of China to the apocalyptic whore and to the enemies of God's kingdom is clear. And for cartoonists and novelists of the time, the imagery and horror of Revelation provided a great resource for anti-Chinese illustrations and literature. Puritan Dooner's Last Days of the Republic in 1880 was possibly the first yellow peril novel published in America. It tells a warning tale of continued importation of Chinamen for economic profit and the spread of Chinese populations beyond the American West into New England and the South. The story tells how the Chinese are actually imperial China invading the United States slowly until, quote, "the coil of the Asiatic serpent was gradually encircling the entire body of the victim, now virtually within its grasp. Soon, Chinese armies march across the nation as they finally make their way to Washington, D.C., and the book concludes, the Republic had fought its last battle, and the imperial dragon of China already floated from the dome of the Capitol." In this fear-mongering novel, Babylon China wins, demonstrating the consequences of the idolatrous worship of money in China rather than God and the United States. The final image of the dragon flying over the Capitol building is the Qing dynasty flag of China at that time, which features a Chinese long. Whereas in Chinese cultural tradition, the long symbolizes power and blessing, the emperor, water, and rain, by the 19th century, Europeans had equated long with the demonic dragon and the serpent of the Bible and Revelation in particular. In Revelation, the dragon first appears in chapter 12. It is a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on its heads. And this is the threatening beast ultimately defeated by an army of angels led by the archangel Michael. It says, "And a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the world. The dragon is ultimately cast into the lake of fire, where it is destroyed." This is the dragon, Satan, that the European and American imagination equated with the ancient Long of China and Chinese peoples. For example, British missionary and diplomat to China, George Tredescant Lay, documented a spring festival in 1841, and he writes, "The festival is strongly marred by the thought that the graces of human life and refinements of art are made to honor the devil. For there he was in the parade under the semblance of a huge dragon, the old serpent. The Chinese have been faithful in handing down from father to son the abominable worship of Satan." In this typical European interpretation, China and the Chinese are a satanic kingdom, an enemy of the Christian West. Robert Wolter's 1882 novel, A Short and Truthful History of the Taking of California and Oregon by the Chinese in the year AD 1899, goes even further, making explicit use of Satan and the text of Revelation. In the novel, Chinese workers spread everywhere and take over the West Coast, led by a mysterious Chinese Prince Ca, who sails to San Francisco Bay inward through the Golden Gate. which is both the Golden Gate Strait in the Bay and an allusion to the U.S. identity as a divine and heavenly land. The narrator states that, quote, Prince Ta bore less resemblance to a human being than he did to Milton's Satan. The author ends by warning his readers that China will take over the world, and he quotes from the prophecies of Revelation to identify Prince Ta and the threat from the Orient. The last lines of the novel declare that, quote, the black dragon has forced the passage of the Golden Gate. This is the same dragon as the satanic China depicted in political cartoons such as The Dragon's Choice, which appeared on the cover of Harper's Weekly in 1900 at the climax of the conflict between the Boxers and the Euro-American alliance. The image shows the menacing beast taking its stand on the seashore with the beast breathing smoke from its mouth and standing over villages on fire. Facing it is Uncle Sam, symbolizing the United States, white-haired, muscular, dressed in sailor whites, and adorned with stars aboard a mighty white ship, a strong bulwark with cannon aimed and ready. The bestial, raving, dark, and satanic China is challenged by the rational, white United States. A few years prior to Rogers' The Dragon's Choice is Hermann Nachfuss's Yellow Peril, Die Gelbe Gefahr, in imagery even more explicitly drawn from Revelation. Knackfuss's illustration circulated first in the Leipziger Illustrierte Zeitung in Germany in 1895, and after gaining popularity throughout Europe, was printed stateside in Harper's Weekly in 1898. Knackfuss based his drawing on a sketch by Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had commissioned the piece. The Kaiser reportedly had a nightmare in which he saw this vision, an apocalyptic warning against the encroachment of Asia, especially Japan and China at the time, on European nations. On the right-hand side of the illustration looms a colossal flaming Buddha. And like the Whore of Babylon, it is seated on the seven-headed beast. The Buddha rides on black storm clouds that form a menacing dragon with glowing eyes. The perspective of the audience is directed to several European nations represented as white goddesses and woman warriors dressed in a mix of nationalist and Greco-Roman symbols. They stand in the foreground on a cliff under a shining white cross. Leading them is the Archangel Michael, portrayed with typical iconography, with wings, Romanesque armor, and a flaming sword. He extends an arm in a sweeping gesture towards the battlefield, upon which he will soon lead them to war, just as he does in Revelation against the great dragon. Besides being the Yellow Peril, the demonic threat overtaking the land, Chinese were also labeled as especially diseased and disgusting, a belief that continues to this day in the US, as shown by anti-Asian hate and violence during the COVID pandemic. Public discourse, leaky disease, and plagues with Chinese immigrants also borrow descriptions and imagery from the Book of Revelation to build up anti-immigrant movements. This is a pest poison advertisement from the 1880s. In the center is a caricatured Chinaman about to eat a rat while holding another ready in his left hand. Above them reads the slogan, "They must go," referring, of course, both to the rats and to the Chinaman. The text is an obvious allusion to the political slogan, "The Chinese must go," coined by Dennis Kearney of the Working Men's Party of California in 1877. This advertisement uses a common trope for unwanted foreigners, depicting them as eating what is vile, and to identify both the Chinese and rats as pests, implying that the poison eaten by the rats that are then eaten by the Chinese can work effectively to rid the buyer of both. The Chinaman's braid, a traditional Chinese symbol with political significance, sticks out behind the man's head, its angles and curves mirroring the tail of the rat he is about to eat. This was just one of multiple US illustrations portraying the Chinese as a literal pest on the level of rats, mice, bedbugs, flies, and roaches, the pests killed by the poison. In 1877, the San Francisco satirical magazine The Wasp ran a cartoon titled Uncle Sam's Farm in Danger. This cartoon participated in the fear-mongering against Chinese refugees fleeing the northern Chinese famine of 1876 to 79. In it, Chinese immigrants are a literal pest, embodying a horrifying plague. A swarm of consuming grasshoppers, the Chinese are depicted as a biblical plague of locusts, particularly the plague described in Revelation 9, which covers the earth after the fifth trumpet of God is blown. Like the apocalyptic locusts, the Chinese insects have faces like human faces, and their braids are like women's hair. As long braids, they simultaneously resemble tails like scorpions with stingers and stick straight out of the backs of their heads like an insect's appendage. Further linking the cartoon with the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation is the demonic figure of famine, driving the grasshoppers on with a cord of whips. Famine and the grasshoppers appear in shades of green, the color of the fourth horse of the apocalypse, which death rides over the earth to kill with, quote, sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. That's from Revelation chapter 6. Only a simple farm fence stands in the way of the horde of Chinese locusts, a sign of weakness at the U.S. border and of U.S. immigration policy. In the apocalyptic, diseased American imagination, the Chinese embody the horrors of Revelation, visit upon the earth. The New York Daily Tribune described Chinese peoples in 1854 as, quote, unclean, filthy beyond all conception, claiming that the Chinese quarter of the city of San Francisco is a byword for sin and filth. The California State Board of Health pronounced in 1862 that Chinese entry into the U.S. would cause national decay, and declared in 1871 that the intermingling with a sensual and depraved people would guarantee the passing on of hereditary vices. Public discourse blamed Chinese for disease and sickness, relying on these perceptions of foreignness linked with degradation and with plague. In the late 1860s and during the 70s and 80s, San Francisco suffered several smallpox epidemics, and some Chinese immigrants were found carrying the disease when they arrived at city ports. Hysteria grew, and medical officials claimed that it was an essentially Chinese disease. In 1883, the WASP ran San Francisco's Three Graces, a cartoon depicting specters of malaria, smallpox, and leprosy, looming over the city of San Francisco, with the Altenauer, a ship that carried immigrants with smallpox, arriving in the harbor. These giant figures are ghostly, demonic, and bestial, and they tower over the city, threatening its lone brave church with its crucifix, representative of the Christian citizens who must guard against such corrupting invaders. Leprosy, the Chinese disease, is a caricatured Chinaman wearing a braid, and from his left hand flows something labeled Chinatown. This may be the disease itself poured out on filthy quarters, echoing the image of the angel who pours plague from the bowl of God's wrath on those who worship the demonic beast in Revelation 16. Or the white object streaming from the Chinese specter's hand may also be a flowing cloth, a piece of laundry, symbolic of a key employment of Chinese immigrants as launderers, clothes washers. By the date of the Three Graces in 1883, anti-Chinese politicians and cartoonists had spread rumors that Chinese workers cleaned and pressed laundry in filthy ways, claiming they spit water from their mouths onto cloth for ironing. So the San Francisco Board of Health conducted investigations into the city's laundries in 1896 and 97. Medical journals claimed that Chinese launderers could be spreading consumption, syphilis, or skin diseases through mouth spray and the filthiness of their work areas. And articles identified Chinese laundries as opium dens and implied they corrupt whites of both sexes who are frequenters of the places by day and by night. For Chinese living in the U.S., their identification by white societies as diseased, pestilent, and corrupting meant the constant surveilling and policing of their homes and businesses, accompanied by the threat of invasive fumigation, unsafe quarantine and isolation, and removal from their homes to segregated hospital quarters and deportation. Health inspections continued after the establishment of the Angel Island Detention Center, which boasted larger facilities that could house new, more invasive procedures that were never routine at Ellis Island, the U.S. immigration port in New York City that received immigrants from Europe. The island's health inspectors separated Asian men and women, made them strip naked, and demanded fecal samples for bacteriological scrutiny. The focus on parasites, undetectable except through microscopic examination, grew fears that Chinese and other Asians might appear healthy while passing on invisible parasites once entering America. Chinese immigrants were thus a plague themselves and carrying invisible microscopic plagues as well. The Chinese body, the Asian body, and all unwanted bodies that had to be kept from entering the US were identified not only as carriers of parasites, but also indistinguishable from pests and disease. In describing the filthy quarters of San Francisco's Chinatown as likely to harbor cholera, news writers identified the neighborhood as a place of stagnant water and dirty clothing and filthy bodies. These three elements, impure water, dirty clothes, and filthy bodies, are continuously emphasized in the American public discourse that associates unwanted immigrants with plagues and disease. They are also the key characteristics of the enemies of God and their destruction in the book of Revelation, in which waters turn to poison and blood, idolaters do not wash their robes or live in shameful nakedness or dress in degenerate red and purple, and the sinful suffer from painful sores or degrade their bodies sexually. The New Jerusalem of Revelation and its citizens present opposite characteristics. Through the city flows the pristine river of the water of life, from which the blessed may drink. The holy citizens of the New Jerusalem, angels of God, and the Son of Man wear clean, washed, white robes, and their bodies are pure of sexual corruption and are holy and healed by the fruit of the trees of life growing along the river. It is not just coincidence that American anti-immigrant discourse should use the same elements as Revelation, both to describe itself as clean and pure and the unwanted as filthy. The long and persistent use of the New Jerusalem to imagine America had incorporated into immigration language the vocabulary of purity, filth, health, and disease in distinctly Christian modes. This is especially clear when analyzing mission stories of Chinese conversion to Christianity, in which individuals become qualified for inclusion in America. Such transitions occur through personal and individual conversion to Protestant Christianity that go hand in hand with markers of cleanliness like those of Revelation. For example, in one San Francisco church publication from 1900, a white missionary visits a Chinese woman who was taken from Chinatown during a raid on lodgings said to be a brothel. The Chinese woman converted to Christianity and moved into a house described as full of, quote, God's love, pure air, and sunshine. Her curtains are described as a snowy white. And during the visit, she is doing laundry. She is washing her robes like they do in Revelation 22. Blessed are those who wash their robes, that they will have the right to the tree of life and may enter the city by the gates. For Chinese immigrants wanting to enter the gates of America, the country could also be seen as a heavenly destination. San Francisco fog blankets the bay almost every morning, sometimes melting away as the sun rises. A Chinese immigrant named Xu Qing watched these mists dissolve over the water as he waited aboard to enter the Golden Gate Strait on a September morning in 1868. He had set sail from Guangdong over 60 days before, and the sight of land filled him with a marvelous sense of fulfillment and arrival. When he wrote his memoir, Reminiscences of an Early Chinese Minister, 64 years later, he too described his immigration to America in apocalyptic language. But instead of invasion of demons or as an approaching plague, Qing saw his own arrival as a fulfillment of a heavenly promise, as the arrival of someone who looks forward to belonging in the blessed realm. He writes, to be actually at the golden gate of the land of our dreams, the feeling that welled up inside us was indescribable. I wonder whether the ecstasy before the pearly gates of the celestial city above could surpass what we felt at the moment when we realized we had reached our destination. Writing this towards the end of his life, Qing, who had been baptized at the age of 20 and went on to serve the Christian Chinese community in New York City, fills his first sight of America with Christian language, using the dominant metaphor of America as the New Jerusalem. But after the initial hope and excitement of seeing the shores of the celestial city, Qing encountered the violent and fearful reality faced by Chinese immigrants in the 1870s and 80s. The useful and steady Chinese worker, Qing recalls, became overnight the mysterious Chinaman, an unknown object of dread. Instead of entering the heavenly city, the Chinese were not allowed in, but abandoned to the flames, like the fate of anyone whose name was not found written in the book of life, and so was thrown into the fire. So Qing's recollection of the terrible persecution of Chinese is laced with flames. He says, there were long processions at night with big torchlights and lanterns carrying the slogan, "The Chinese must go," and mass meetings where fiery tongues flayed the Chinese bogey. Chinese immigrants lived not in the golden light of the celestial city, but in the red glow of flames and the dreaded darkness of night. We were simply terrified, Qing writes. We kept indoors after dark for fear of being shot in the back. Children spit on us as we passed by and called us rats. By 1910, after anti-Chinese immigration laws had passed, all ships arriving with Chinese immigrants stopped not on the mainland, but were quarantined on Angel Island. There, Chinese and other Asian immigrants were detained, sometimes for weeks and even longer. The Chinese men detained carved poetry into the barracks they lived in. And although they were surrounded by heavenly names, Angel Island, Golden Gate, Golden State, Gold Mountain, they knew it was not so for them. One of the poems reads, not the one shown here, "This place is called an island of immortals, when in fact this mountain wilderness is a prison." A Chinese woman wrote a letter home about her detention saying, "We were to go to the immigration station, Angel Island. Unfortunately, we were not able to find any angels there, but we did see many heartless human beings." The rejection, interrogation, inspection, and humiliation of those seeking entry to America stands in sharp contrast to the promise of paradise and Reagan's open doors for those with the will and the heart to enter. This does not mean that America failed as the New Jerusalem, but rather that the metaphor continued and continues today to serve the political interests of those using it in immigration discourse. America as the New Jerusalem, with its gleaming walls and foundations set as a shining city on a hill, presents a fresh beginning, moral aspirations, promises of wealth, and promises of safety and stability. But with the purity of those within the walls comes the exclusion of the impure without, the dogs and sorcerers and fornicators and murderers and idolaters. That is the language the American government is still using against immigrants today, speaking of invasions by enemies, likening them to animals, or as eating family cats and dogs, and describing them as godless and violent in order to justify their deportation and extermination. Clearly, biblical apocalyptic and the Book of Revelation are powerful texts used by many across the centuries. What we see today in the United States is the use of its extreme language dangerously applied to an earthly nation that imagines itself as the New Jerusalem. Thank you for listening.